The Middle East: death, destruction, hostages, torture, regime change, terrorists, religious war, hatred. Enter Collin Mayfield, an independent journalist from Alabama who runs into fires. Brave Colin has reported from Iraq, Ukraine, Myanmar, Nigeria, Haiti, and several other hotbeds across the globe. Most recently, with Hezbollah in Lebanon, and then into Syria as HTS took control.
I wore my armor a couple times, but eventually I gave up on that because, at the end of the day, if an airstrike hits you, your plates are not going to protect you.
On this episode of Some Future Day, Colin documents his first-hand account in Lebanon as Hezbollah and Israel engaged in war.
A lot of my reportage is not for the expert. A lot of it is for a younger person who might not have paid close attention to said conflict, and they're wanting to learn about it from a beginner's level.
Colin, thank you for joining me on this special edition of Some Future Day. Colin, it's great to see you. Welcome to Some Future Day. We've been talking for so long. I first met you, I believe you were in Syria, and it's amazing to see you on the ground back in the United States. Why don't you take a second and explain to the audience who you are, where you're from, and then we could segue into what you were doing in the Middle East.
All right, awesome. My name is Collin Mayfield. I am from the United States. Particularly, I'm from Alabama. It's where I grew up and lived for most of my life. And I'm a freelance journalist. I mostly report on conflict. I've reported in Iraq, Syria, Ukraine, Myanmar, Nigeria, Haiti, a number of different places. So for the past several years, I have been working as a journalist covering conflicts in different parts of the world.
So these are like some real hotbeds across the globe. And I'm just curious, I've always wondered, what goes on in your head? You see something flaring up, you're like, oh, I gotta get there. I got my gear, I got my camera. How does that process work intellectually for you?
It's different every time, and a lot of it comes down to just paying close attention to the news and making a judgment call on what the best place to fly to report might be. We all know hindsight is 20/20, but sometimes you can predict when something might happen and position yourself to be in the right place at the right time. So, for example, when I reported in Ukraine, I arrived 3 days before the Russian invasion. So I was in Ukraine at the very beginning of the invasion, and that's just because after looking at a lot of the evidence and statements from U.S. intelligence and seeing the troop buildups on the Russian and Belarusian borders, it became kind of obvious that an invasion was going to come. So I went there, and I made the decision to go there. Or with one of my more recent trips, I left the United States for Lebanon in October, and I had been closely paying attention to that conflict for a while. I reported in Lebanon last year from March through May, reporting on the Israel-Hezbollah war there. But back then it was just a low-intensity conflict, not like it escalated last year. So last September, after the pager attack and the walkie-talkie attack perpetrated by Israel, and then the assassination of Hezbollah's General Secretary, or Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah, that's when I decided to get to Beirut as fast as possible. So, really, a lot of it comes down to just paying close attention to the news and then making a judgment call on where you think the best story may be that you can access.
So since you're an independent journalist, you're organizing the entire trip on your own. So do you mind walking us through? It's September. You're presumably in your home state of Alabama. You see things flaring up in Lebanon. You make a decision you want to go, but then literally what happens? You're booking a flight to where? Is it difficult to enter Lebanon? Do you have to
Yes.
take some circuitous route? It's such an interesting part. How do you get your feet on the ground first?
So, because of the war between Israel and Hezbollah, and keep in mind, Israel invaded Lebanon in October of last year, October 1st. So, at that point, I had known I needed to get a flight, but because, there was an army invading the country, needless to say, most countries or most airlines had suspended flights to Lebanon, and there was only one airline that was still flying, and that was the national Lebanese carrier, MEA, Middle East Air. I mean, there are other carriers that were flying into Lebanon at the time too, like Iran Air, but obviously, as a U.S. citizen, I'm not going to go to Tehran and get a flight to Beirut. So what I did was I flew on Qatar Airways from Atlanta to Doha. And then when I was in Doha, I got on a flight to Beirut with MEA. It was very few people were on that flight, most of whom were Lebanese. And it yeah, it was just it was the only airline flying in. You could see some smoke from Beirut as the flights are landing. So it's just a very tense flight. And thankfully for me, MEA was still flying, because otherwise it would have been very difficult for me to get into Lebanon. I would have had to fly to Cyprus and take a boat, because obviously you can't cross the border that the Israelis control, as the two countries were, or not the two countries were at war, but rather a country was at war with a non-state actor within another country. So obviously I couldn't cross the Israeli border, couldn't cross the border of Syria at the time because the Assad regime was not very friendly. So at that time, Lebanon was essentially like an island. I mean, there's no border that you could cross at the time, so you only could fly in or take a boat from Cyprus. So, fortunately for me, I was able to get a flight.
So you're flying in on MEA. You see smoke coming up from Lebanon. You're landing in Beirut or the Beirut area, and you're holding an American passport, right?
Yes.
And what's going on in your mind? Like, as you're preparing to get off the plane, are you concerned about getting through customs?
No, because I've been to Lebanon a few times. I mean, I had my body armor, but there was a full-scale war happening, and the capital was getting hit with airstrikes every day. So the customs agents, they could not have cared less about my body armor. And when they found out I was a Sahafi journalist who was there to report on the bombing in Beirut, the customs officials seemed pleased to let me pass without any issues whatsoever.
Amazing. So you have body armor. What does that mean exactly?
I rarely wear it, to be honest with you. I have a plate carrier with level 4 plates, so enough that I could get shot and be fine. They're ceramic plates, so the bullet would shatter and embed into the ceramic, whereas steel plates are an inferior form of body armor because the bullet it's called spalling. The bullet can like ricochet and break apart, and you could survive getting shot in the chest wearing steel plates, but you might die because a lead bullet fractures apart and a piece of it goes through your throat. So I have my ceramic plates. That way, if they get shot, the bullet will like embed into the plate and I won't have to worry about ricochets. And then I also have a ballistic helmet. But I seldom wear it. I mean, I wore my armor in Ukraine, and I wore it in Nigeria a few times. In Haiti a few times, but I didn't really have much of a reason to wear it in Lebanon. I mean, there were a few instances that I did when I was on like Hezbollah press tours, for example, in Dahia, which is there. It's a very it's a suburb in Beirut that's widely considered to be Hezbollah's administrative capital. It's where the Israelis focused the bulk of their bombing within the Beirut area. So when I went to Dahia, I wore my armor a couple times, but eventually I gave up on that because, I mean, at the end of the day, if an airstrike hits you, your plates are not going to protect you. And I didn't wear body armor the entire time I was in Myanmar, and there I was actually in firefights. So sometimes it's just more weight than it's worth.
Is body armor expensive?
A few $100s.
Okay, so you got your body armor, you got your photography equipment, you're coming off the plane, no problem getting through customs. And where do you go first? Do you check into a hotel?
A colleague and I had rented an apartment on Airbnb. So we booked
Airbnb
an
is amazing.
apartment in a Christian neighborhood called Mar Mikhail. And what a lot of people didn't understand about the Israel-Hezbollah war, when people would see pictures of Beirut that the Associated Press or New York Times or whoever is showing, people will see these pictures of Dahia, a suburb of Beirut that's been very heavily bombed, and they'll assume that the entire city looks like that. Whereas in actuality, I mean, the city of Beirut is very divided. So some Christian neighborhoods like Mar Mikhail or Jemaisi or Ashrafia, you really couldn't even feel that the war was going on. I mean, there was no destruction, no radical political posters. I mean, for the record, those Christian neighborhoods are mostly supporting the opponents of Hezbollah, the Lebanese forces, which is a right-wing political party and former militia. But meanwhile, in Dahia, it's completely different. Everything's rubble. There's Hezbollah flags everywhere. So I was in this one Christian neighborhood that was a couple of kilometers away from the bombing, but it felt a world away. It was just a completely different atmosphere. It's really a tale of two cities, to say the least.
But your Airbnb, the view was in clear sight of the
No,
ongoing bombing?
no, you couldn't see the ongoing bombing because Beirut is a very hilly city, and from like Mar Mikhail, you would not be able to see Dahia. It's too far away, and there are too many hills in between. But we could hear them, and some of the airstrikes were loud enough that you could feel them. I remember there was one day I was taking a nap, and I was woken up when I felt like the shockwave. But I mean, in general, though, most of the strikes were very I mean, they were far away in Dahia. They were nowhere near the neighborhood that I lived in. Although eventually I did move to a different apartment building, and this was in a different neighborhood, a neighborhood called Hamra in a different part of Beirut. And there was one airstrike in Hamra while I was there, but it was about, I want to say, a kilometer and a half from my apartment, so it wasn't particularly close.
So, Colin, let me ask you, so getting back into the psyche of the journalist. So what's your goal? Now you got your Airbnb, you're all set up, you're in Beirut. You know there are other news outlets and journalists in the area, Western and beyond. So what's your point of difference as an independent journalist? What's your goal? What are you trying to capture that would distinguish your experience from the other journalists? What is the news that you're trying to find?
I don't know. As far as that's a difficult question because some conflicts are a lot more covered than others, and some places I've reported, like Myanmar, for example, I was one of the few foreigners who has been to Chin State, and I spent a couple of months in that part of Myanmar reporting. So I was the only foreigner in Chin State while I was there. Whereas Beirut, I have dozens and dozens of Western friends who live there. So I had a lot less to add to the conversation with regard to the Israel-Hezbollah war, but I was trying to come at it from I'd like I don't want to sound pretentious or anything, but I feel like with my work I just want to educate people about misconceptions that there may be. I want people to know that I'm not necessarily coming from a big name legacy outlet. I have my own personal biases that I'll keep to myself, but I try not to show those to anyone. But I'd say that my main goal is just, I don't know, really just to educate the average person. I mean, a lot of my reportage is not for the expert. A lot of it is for a younger person who might not have paid close attention to said conflict, and they're wanting to learn about it from a beginner's level. So I like to think that I'm able to explain the history of why something's happening and the events on the ground without making it too difficult to understand.
Okay, so that's interesting. So let's break it down from your perspective. During this last conflict in October, your like, for example, your first day when you go out and start shooting, what is it that you went to cover? Let's break down, I guess, your experience in Lebanon during this time period.
So immediately upon getting to Beirut, I just had to kind of get my bearings and figure out exactly where I was going to go. And keep in mind, at this point, I mean, I think a brief timeline might be in order. So as we all know, there was the October 7th attack in 2023 when Hamas crossed out of the Gaza Strip and started attacking within Israel. Now, up in Lebanon, Hezbollah decided that they were going to launch rockets at Israel in solidarity with their ally Hamas. I mean, their words, not mine. And so after that, there was this low-intensity conflict. And when I was in Lebanon in March through April, this low-intensity conflict had not been going on for very long. It had only been a few months at this point, and there were only a few 100,000 people displaced at the time. When I got there later in October, after Nasrallah was assassinated and after the pager attack, it was immediately different. At this point, it was a full-scale war, so several 100,000 people, nearing 1 million people, had been displaced, mostly from the south and Bekaa Valley. So there were IDPs, internally displaced persons, all across the streets of Beirut. I remember those first couple of days when I returned in October. I went to Martyr Square, which is near the city center, and it's very famous for being the backdrop of the 2019 revolution. When I was at Martyr Square, there were a bunch of IDPs from the south and IDPs from neighborhoods like Dahia, these Shia areas with a very heavy Hezbollah presence. So these IDPs were all over the city, and you just see them congregating in tent villages on the sides of roads and in public squares. So it was very clear when I got back that the stakes were a lot higher, just given the sheer numbers of displaced people that were just on the streets in Beirut. And it was also a lot more tense this time because there's this constant Israeli drone. There's an MK that was flying above, and those MKs can fly at a much higher altitude than these were flying, and the popular consensus was that it was a psychological tactic to make things uncomfortable for the civilians in the area. But nevertheless, just that constant 24/7 sound of the drone buzzing and the occasional airstrike and the hundreds of people just in the streets, it was very stressful immediately, and not like the Lebanon I had been to previously.
So did you have a chance to connect with any senior leaders with Hezbollah or interact with anyone within Hezbollah where the conversation was substantively like eye-opening to you, where you were able to see something different? Remember, like, you're talking about reporting the news in a way that is truly factual and different perhaps than what we see here in Western mainstream media. So did any of those conversations with a member from Hezbollah show you something and give you the ability to report something different or unexpected?
The issue with Hezbollah is it's such a secretive organization. It's incredibly difficult to arrange interviews with members of Hezbollah and to speak with them. It is possible, and I have been able to meet members of Hezbollah, but interview questions, I mean, they never would give anything substantial. You'd get a lot of repeat answers, resistance good, Israel bad, the same things that we'd hear all the time from different members of Hezbollah. Very few people told us much that was unique. There was very little that we learned that we didn't already know, which, I mean, from a security standpoint, that makes sense. I mean, you don't want to be spouting secrets out that way your enemy could maybe hear them, but it made it frustrating. Hezbollah was a very difficult group to try and photograph and work around. It was quite the obstacle. I just remember there were a number of times that we were told to delete photos that we had taken or not to take photos of things, or there were times when we'd go to airstrike sites, and what you don't see in any of these photos of these airstrike sites are the dozens of armed Hezbollah members just standing off to the side, out of frame, that you're not allowed to photograph. the ones who tell you that you can't photograph the bodies, which I found interesting because in Gaza, they're so eagerly showing off their dead, whereas in Lebanon, Hezbollah was very strict about not letting people photograph any corpses whatsoever. I remember I was at a funeral, or I was at a cemetery where a Hezbollah member was being buried, and I saw an Iranian cleric who I took a photo of, and then some Hezbollah members came up to me and made me delete it. And while that is frustrating, I'm often reminded of Mao's quote that political power comes from the barrel of a gun. And when a bunch of heavily armed Hezbollah guys tell you don't photograph something or don't or delete this photo, you'd probably be wise to do that.
Have you seen colleagues of yours ever push back on that, and were there repercussions?
I mean, they just won't let you access things. They'll just kick you out. They'll force you out. I never saw any instances of people like getting violent towards my colleagues or colleagues refusing to delete photos, but I mean, it's just, you're not exactly in a position where you could refuse to delete a photo.
Yeah. So what was like the biggest image that you remember in your mind that you were not able to shoot because of the force that Hezbollah carries when they, you know,
I
share those
remember
words?
I remember there was this one airstrike I was photographing the aftermath of in Jinnah, and I remembered seeing a body being pulled from the rubble, and immediately the Hezbollah guys were yelling at us to put our cameras down and like covering up our cameras. And my suspicion, and this is just my personal opinion and conjecture, my suspicion as to why we were not allowed to photograph any corpses is that Hezbollah would not like some foreign OSINT analyst to be able to determine how many bodies were civilians versus how many bodies were militants. And it's worth noting that the Lebanese Public Health Service doesn't distinguish between the deaths of civilians and militants, and that's incredibly frustrating. So that's one of my suspicions as to why we weren't able to photograph it. And then there was another instance where we were photographing a strike that was near to the Rafik Hariri airport, and we were told to leave. And the rumor that we heard was that there were some other people who were going to be coming afterwards to investigate the site. So presumably some higher in command was coming.
Who do you think it was?
I have no idea. I couldn't tell you.
Yeah. What was like the most shocking image that you shot that like really shocked the conscious? Like what was in Lebanon specifically, like
Yes.
what really was like the most horrific imagery that you brought to life?
Well, again, I mean, as far as horrific imagery goes, it's a lot harder in Lebanon to access things. I mean, again, Hezbollah is very secretive. It's difficult to get places. I mean, I'm not aware of very many people that went to the south who went to the front. I mean, it was doable, but it's very difficult, and you had to be very well connected to go to the south where there was that front line with Israel. But one image I took in Lebanon that stands out to me very much was this little baby named Ivana who was from the south, and she was wounded in an artillery strike, an Israeli artillery strike that hit her home, and she was taken up to Beirut to this hospital in this place called Jaitawi, where I met her. And yeah, that little girl was a media star. I saw so many different newspapers photographing this one child that was wounded, but fortunately she recovered, and I visited her a few times in the hospital, and that was one that stands out to me a lot. Just seeing this young girl covered in little burns and bandaged up.
So you visited her in the hospital because you're
Yes.
compassionate, not to get the photograph, correct?
I mean, I did take the photograph. I'd like to think I'm compassionate, but it was for the story. I wasn't exactly doing volunteer work at the hospital.
Yeah.
I did go there with colleagues to meet her and her family and talk to them about their experiences during the war.
Got it. So, Colin, I know that you're not in the work of doing portraits, but the fact is that you have shot some really, really interesting people. You got close ups of incredible people who are in the mix of all of this. How did you do that? How did you get in front of them?
Well, oftentimes I will just like check the websites of different militant groups and see when there are going to be press releases or press conferences. Other times I will arrange with what's called a fixer, and in journalism, a fixer is basically like a point of contact who can help you to get access to something. So if I wanted to access somebody in Hezbollah, I would go to my fixer, who's somebody who works with journalists, and their entire job is just to coordinate between a journalist and the militant group that, needs to be covered. So I would just contact fixers, and they would set me up to put me in the positions where I would need to be to either meet or, photograph these important figures. So, I mean, a lot of it I found out about through press releases, through social media, planned protests, all sorts of
Colin,
ways.
who pays the fixer?
Fixers are journalists. So so the way it works in journalism is a journalist pays a fixer for translation and for making arrangements. But all of that money, like that's the fixer's income. Like that money is not going toward any militant groups. That'd be unethical on so many ways. But yeah, so newspapers and journalists will pay their fixers, who in turn help set up the access that the journalists need to get the story.
Interesting.
So so be it me like finding portraits to take at protests, or just hearing from press releases that there's going to be like a press conference. And it was actually at protests and press conferences that I got two different portraits that are of note. One was a man named Fatah Sharif, and another is a man named Mohammed Afif. Those are both men who I took portraits of in Beirut, and both of them were later assassinated by Israel. So there have been two people I've taken portraits of who have later been assassinated. So that is Fatah Sharif. He was the leader of Hamas in Lebanon. According to the IDF, he was a liaison between Hamas and Hezbollah, coordinating Hezbollah activities within Lebanon. And while he wasn't doing that, he was employed at UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Work Agency for Palestinian Refugees. So he was an UNRWA school teacher and then principal. So Fatah Sharif made some statements on Facebook that...
Did he tell you that, Colin? Did he tell you he was employed there? Did you see his ID?
No, I met him at a protest, so it's known that he was an UNRWA employee. Yeah, he was an UNRWA employee. He was a principal at an UNRWA school, and these pictures right here are at a protest at the UNRWA office in Beirut. So he was suspended, and while I was at the protest, everyone was saying there were chants of things like nationalism is not a crime, don't punish our national identity, and everyone downplayed to me what he did. Everyone I spoke to was like, oh, he just made some pro-Palestine statements on Facebook, and that's why the UN fired him. And the more you look into it, the more you find out that those pro-Palestine statements were statements in support of Hamas, and then it turned out that he was a member of Hamas, because when Israel assassinated him on September 29th, and the IDF said he was a member of Hamas, in general, I like to double check things. So I went to the Hamas website, and Hamas put out a press release mourning Fatah Sharif as one of their commanders. And if the IDF and Hamas are saying the same thing, it's probably true. So he was killed September 29th. And that was after Nasrallah was killed, shortly before I arrived in Lebanon. And it was in that period in mid-September where Israel was really escalating what had been a low-intensity conflict. And then in September of last year, the Israelis really intensified their bombing across the country, and they targeted a lot of Hamas and Hezbollah and Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and other like militant groups based in Lebanon were targeted in this like escalation in September. So it was like after this man's death and after Nasrallah's death, and then the invasion on October 1st that I was able to come to Lebanon.
It's kind of interesting because it's obvious then, you say it and show how obvious it is that this individual was working for the United Nations and Hamas.
Well, he was working for Hamas secretly. Nobody knew he was working for Hamas until after he was assassinated, and then we all learned that he was in Hamas. So he was suspended without pay, and the UN was saying that they were investigating him while he was being suspended, but I don't think that they had any idea how deep into Hamas he was until after he was assassinated.
So he was a school teacher?
A teacher first and then a principal.
Wow, that's some school.
And then, so then later, after I got to Lebanon, I was in Dahia, which, as we've talked about before, is widely considered to be, Hezbollah's administrative center. It's where I've met with members of the group many times, or not many, but a few times. And it was in Dahia where I went to a press conference that Hezbollah was having, and the Hezbollah spokesperson there who was speaking was a man named Mohammed Afif. And about 5 days after I saw Afif at this press conference where he said that Hezbollah, its capabilities haven't been depleted yet, and that Hezbollah could still continue fighting with Israel, which turned out, not past a couple weeks. But nevertheless, that was Afif's last ever press conference, and he was assassinated about 5 days later in Beirut while meeting with some Syrian Ba'athist party officials at the Ba'athist party office.
So is your image the last public image of him?
No, there were other people at that press conference.
Colin, thank you for bringing us into this fascinating yet very harsh reality, Hezbollah. Indeed, this region along the Israeli-Lebanon border will remain hostile for years to come. Be sure to join me and Colin next week on Some Future Day when we dive deep into the world of Syria, al-Shara, HTS, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS. And once again, be sure to watch these episodes on YouTube, where all of Colin's striking imagery can be viewed. I promise you, these photos are one of a kind. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Some Future Day. I know your time is super valuable, so I hope you learned how you can leverage emerging technology to improve your life. And exciting news, my new book, Some Future Day, How AI is Going to Change Everything, is now available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Target, and other major booksellers across the globe. I am so proud to share that because of your support, the book topped the charts. It became #1 bestseller in cryptocurrency, #1 bestseller in artificial intelligence, and #1 bestseller in robotics. So, if you're curious and ready to learn how AI can enhance your career, your community, and your family, get yourself a copy today.